The purpose of this presentation is to give a status update on the management of coal combustion residuals, or CCR, in the state of Alabama. This presentation will, 1, provide background on how CCR materials were historically produced and managed, 2, lay out a timeline of significant events that led to the promulgation of state and federal CCR regulations, 3, provide an overview of the closure status and the closure options selected by the utilities that are currently under review by the department, 4, give an update regarding the groundwater assessments being conducted at each site, and finally, 5, provide an anticipated timeline of future submittals and events. CCR, or coal ash, is generated from the burning of coal for the purpose of generating electricity by electric utilities and independent power producers. Typically, coal is pulverized prior to feeding the material into the boiler where the coal is combusted. The heavier waste material, bottom ash or boiler slag, is collected from the bottom of the boiler and crushed. Historically, this waste material was mixed with water or sluice before being transported to the ash ponds or surface impoundments. The lighter waste material, fly ash, exits the boiler with the flue gas where it is collected in a baghouse or electrostatic precipitator. The waste ash material is collected in a hopper and, similar to the bottom ash, was sluiced and sent to the ash ponds. The flue gas exiting the baghouse or precipitator is then sent to a scrubber where sulfur dioxide levels are reduced in a chemical reaction using limestone. The resulting byproduct is a synthetic gypsum material that is also regulated under the CCR rules. This material can be beneficially used in the wallboard industry. Therefore, it is not commingled with the bottom and fly ash waste materials. The surface impoundments in which the sluice bottom ash and fly ash was discharged served as the settling pond, where the water flowed from one end of the unit to the other, allowing the CCR materials to settle out. The utilities would discharge the treated wastewater out of their NPDES permitted outfall. Many of the CCR surface impoundments in Alabama have been in operation for upwards of 50 years, and over that time have accumulated millions of tons of CCR material. This map shows the CCR universe in the state. Alabama has 14 CCR units, 11 of which are surface impoundments, and then there are 3 landfills at 8 sites that are currently regulated by the state and federal CCR regulations. These are indicated by red and blue dots. The blue dots indicate the CCR units that have been capped. One note, there are 2 legacy sites indicated by yellow dots. These CCR units were closed prior to the promulgation of the federal and state CCR regulations and are currently exempt from the CCR regulations. There are indications from EPA that these units will eventually be added to the regulated CCR universe by future rulemaking.
There have been quite a few significant events that have led us to where we are in terms of CCR management. The first of those occurred in October of 1980 when, as part of the Solid Waste Disposal Act of 1980, the Bevel exemption was passed at the federal level. This exempted fossil fuel combustion waste, including coal combustion waste, from the definition of a hazardous waste. So, by definition, CCR is not a hazardous waste. At the same time, in the state of Alabama, under state law and subsequently ADEM regulations, CCR was exempted from the definition of a solid waste. This meant that in Alabama, CCR was not regulated at all as a solid waste. In 2008, there was a release of CCR material in Kingston, Tennessee due to a breach of the impoundment dike. As a result, millions of gallons of coal ash was released into the environment. Here is an aerial image taken after the spill. You can see where the dike failed and the CCR material was released. There was no loss of life, but there were millions of dollars of loss of property. This brought the question of how to manage CCR material to the forefront. As a result, EPA issued draft federal rules in 2010 for the management of coal combustion materials. Pending the issuance of federal CCR regulations, in May of 2011, the state of Alabama, at the urging of ADEM, removed, through a statutory change, the exemption of CCR from the definition of a solid waste, thus making CCR a regulated waste. Subsequently, in 2012, the ADEM solid waste regulations were amended to reflect this change. This change allowed utilities to continue using their impoundments for the purposes of water treatment, but if the impoundments were cleaned out, the excavated material will have to be treated as a solid waste and disposed in accordance with the solid waste regulations. There was much controversy and scrutiny of the proposed federal CCR rule, but in 2015, EPA issued the final rule. The final rule was very similar to the proposed rule with many similarities to non-hazardous landfill regulations. For example, much like the landfill regulations, there are specific location restrictions for where new facilities can be constructed. In addition, CCR units must have 5 feet of separation from groundwater. There are also requirements that are specific to CCR units, such as structural stability requirements, specific safety requirements, and posting of information on the facility's webpage. Another key difference with the federal rule is that it is self-implementing, which means that regulated utilities were to follow the rule without governmental oversight, and that states and EPA did not have direct enforcement authority. Enforcement, even by states and the federal government, was to be handled through citizen suits. The requirement for facilities to post information on the internet centered on the availability of information for the purpose of enforcement through citizen suits. At the time of issuance of the federal rule, states were not required to adopt the federal rule. In 2016, EPA passed the Water Infrastructure Improvements for the Nation Act, or the WIN Act, which gave states, as well as EPA, the authority to develop a permitting program for the management of CCR material. It also gave states and EPA the authority to take direct enforcement action when necessary. However, before a state can be authorized to operate a CCR program in lieu of the federal program, the proposed state program must be deemed by EPA to be as protective as the federal program. Until a state's program has been approved by EPA, utilities are subject to both the federal and state rules. It's important to note that as with the initial CCR rule, states are not required to adopt CCR rules. In June of 2018, ADEM finalized CCR rules which closely mirrored the CCR federal rule. Prior to finalizing the rules, ADEM provided opportunities for involvement from stakeholders, including the regulated community, environmental groups, and EPA. Immediately after the state rules were finalized, ADEM submitted an application package to obtain program approval for Alabama's CCR program to EPA for consideration. As mentioned previously, in order to be granted approval, a state program must be as protective as the federal program. Once a state program is granted approval, that program operates in lieu of the federal program. To date, 2 state programs have been approved by EPA, Oklahoma and Georgia. In August of 2019, ADEM received the first set of EPA comments on the program approval application. Many of the comments were a result of litigation that has taken place at the federal level, thus causing the federal program to change. As a result, there are a few differences between the state and federal programs. It is anticipated that EPA will issue several amendments to the federal program in response to recent court decisions and pending litigation. ADEM anticipates having to adjust the current CCR rules to conform to the changes at the federal level once there is greater certainty and clarity on what changes will be made. It is important to remember that once a permit is issued by ADEM for the regulated units, there are still 2 functions taking place. Obviously, a major component of the permit is the closure of the CCR unit. At the same time, there is groundwater contamination present at most of the sites. The department is currently working with each of the affected utilities to address that. Both of these activities will be incorporated into the permit, but they are inherently different in scope.
One of the main components of a permit application is the closure plan. The CCR permit applications are a little different than typical solid waste permit applications in that there is already waste in place at the sites. These facilities, in most cases, are seeking to close the CCR units, not operate, as ADEM is evaluating their permit applications. So these CCR closure plans, as expected, are on the forefront and have generated a great deal of public interest. ADEM received 8 permit applications for the 14 CCR units in December of 2018. As mentioned earlier, some facilities have multiple units. Then on April 15, 2019, the state and federal CCR rules required that CCR units that did not comply with the siting standard or were in unlined impoundment with groundwater contamination to cease placing waste in the unit and commence closure. Of the 14 CCR units in the state, 4 units are lined and are proposed to continue to operate, while the remaining 10 CCR units are closed or will be closing. Please note that one of the 10 CCR units that will not be required to close until October of 2020 due to an extension provided in the federal CCR regulations for facilities that were using their ash ponds to also handle their processed wastewater and do not have anywhere else to send this processed wastewater at this time. ADEM sent the first round of comments on the closure plans to the facilities in May of 2019 and has recently received the addendums to their closure plans. These addendums are currently under review by the department. This figure is very similar to a previous slide that indicated the location of the 14 CCR units throughout the state. This figure indicates the location of the 10 CCR units that have closed, are in the process of closing, or in the case of the 1 CCR unit that will begin closure in October of 2020. The 6 red dots indicate the CCR units that are initiating closure. Please note that 1 facility has 3 units closing. The 2 yellow dots indicate the CCR units that have already been capped but are not certified closed by the department. And the 2 blue dots are the legacy sites. These are closed units that were not pulled in under the initial federal CCR rule but are expected to be addressed in future amendments to the federal CCR rule. A lot of discussion about the closure plans is centered on the 2 primary closure methods available for sites: clean closure versus cap in place. This slide shows the state CCR closure regulation, which mirrors the federal regulation and demonstrates that if done correctly, both closure methods are acceptable. Sections B through J of the state CCR rule provide the requirement that facilities must comply with for both of those options, whether they are leaving waste in place by installing a final cover system or through removal of the CCR and decontamination of the CCR unit. It is noted that both of these closure methods have been a staple of closure operations for over 40 years and are similar to how hazardous waste sites are closed. In summary, under the federal and state regulations, either closure option is an acceptable method of closure as long as the specific requirements of the rules are met. Whichever method the utilities propose, ADEM will ensure that the applicable state CCR regulations are followed and that human health and the environment are protected. Let's take a look at the advantages and disadvantages of both closure options. Number 1, positives for clean closure include taking the CCR materials from unlined landfills, impoundments that are in close proximity to waterways and moving the material to a lined landfill facility. Negatives for clean closure include it will take considerably longer to establish source control, estimated to be 2 to 3 times longer. The increase in truck traffic required to move the material to a new site will lead to an increase in accidents, spills, and possibly fatalities. Also, legal issues and lawsuits from communities where the CCR material may end up, basically not in my backyard. 3, positives for closure in place include significantly fewer years to establish source control without the increased traffic on roadways and accidents associated with that activity. 4, the negatives for closure in place include the CCR material will still be in contact with groundwater, will likely still be in contact with groundwater, and in close proximity to the water bodies, and as such would likely end up with long-term groundwater remediation requirements. One last point that will be discussed on future detail, in further detail in upcoming slides. Regardless of the closure method that is selected and ultimately approved, there is already groundwater contamination at each CCR unit that is expected to take years to remediate. The proposed closure methods for the 10 units in Alabama, as detailed in their draft closure plans, include clean closure, cap in place, consolidation and cap in place, or a combination of these methods. Again, this is what has been proposed by the facilities and is currently under review by the department. Number 1, clean closure. There's proposed for clean closure of 1 CCR unit, a 19-acre gypsum surface impoundment, by recycling the material over the next 5 years. 2, a cap in place of 1 CCR unit, a 90-acre surface impoundment that was capped as a 90-acre landfill with no consolidation. 3, consolidate and cap in place of 7 CCR units, the largest a 600-acre surface impoundment, into a 350-acre landfill, and increasing the buffer to to 300 feet. 4, combination of all the above. 1 CCR unit, where, as you can see in the diagram, is a utility that's proposing to clean close the smaller CCR unit by digging up the material and placing it into the larger surface impoundment, which will in turn be consolidated to increase the buffer area and close as a landfill. Again, this is what is being proposed in the closure plans and under review by the department. Please note that EPA's records indicate that approximately 31% of the CCR units nationwide will be clean closed. However, there are a couple misnomers regarding the percentage of facilities that are clean closing. 1, in some cases, what is being referred to as clean closure is actually consolidation, as mentioned before. For example, the state of Georgia has 22 CCR units at 9 sites. EPA records indicate 11 of those units are clean closing and 13 are closing in place. In reality, 2 of the units are clean closing and the other are small ponds that are being consolidated into other CCR units on site. And the second misnomer is, in most cases, it's not the state regulatory agencies that are mandating clean closure, it's the state legislators that have written laws requiring facilities to clean close the CCR units. This slide gives an estimated time to complete the closure process based on information provided in the closure plans that are currently under review by the department. As mentioned previously, most sites initiated closure back in April and are currently doing a lot of site prep and installing best management practices for the upcoming heavy construction activities. The next step at most CCR units is the dewatering of units. The process involves modifying their current NPDES permit to accommodate the increased volume of water being discharged. The majority of the NPDES applications are currently under review by the Department's Water Division. Please note that regardless of what closure method is employed, steps 1 through 3 will have to happen prior to either removal or consolidation of the CCR material begins. So you can see, although they have started closure activities, it's going to be a couple of years before the utilities get past step 3 and ultimately start down the path of clean closure or cap in place. After dewatering the unit is completed, the proposed closure plans indicate that it will take a few more years to consolidate the CCR material, establish grades, install the final cover system, and commence closure. So on average, it's estimated that consolidation and closure will take around 10 years to complete. Earlier, it was noted that it's been estimated that clean closure could take 2 to 3 times longer. The next couple of slides show what typical consolidate and closure in place method would look like. In this example, a 475 acre surface impoundment that shows the unit along the edge of a water body is proposed to be consolidated into a 225 acre landfill, which increases the buffer area from around 100 feet to 600 feet. Also, the current dike system will be left in place to provide an extra layer of protection or secondary containment for the long-term storage of the material in the capped landfill unit. This slide indicates what a typical final closed cap-in-place landfill looks like. This CCR unit was a 75 acre surface impoundment that was consolidated into a 60 acre landfill. In this instance, the material was only slightly pulled away from the water body, but it does have a 100-foot buffer and they added room for the stormwater detention pond. One unique feature of this closure unit is that it's capped with closure turf, similar to what you would see in an indoor football facility. This cap configuration meets or exceeds the permeability standards required of traditional closure caps. It just replaces the 6 inches of topsoil and vegetation with the closure turf fabric and a couple inches of sand. The main benefit of this cap configuration is reduced long-term maintenance costs resulting from correcting erosion rills and keeping grass cut and trees removed. This slide illustrates a traditional cap-in-place closure method. In this closure, there was no consolidation, just conversion of a 90-acre surface impoundment into a 90-acre landfill. Basically, the facility shaped up the CCR material, built an adjacent stormwater detention pond, and placed a standard cap consisting of 60 mil geomembrane, geocomposite, 18 inches of protective soil, 6 inches of topsoil, and a vegetative layer. It is important to remember that both the traditional and alternative cap-in-place closure configurations meet the permeability requirements as required by both state and federal CCR regulations.
It's been stated before, but it is important to reiterate that regardless of the closure method that is selected, groundwater contamination is present and will remain there until it is effectively remediated. This map is very similar to what you've already seen, but it illustrates that all of the CCR units that have groundwater contamination in the state. We know this because in the initial stages of monitoring, the utilities had exceedances of promulgated maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs, for at least one constituent. As a result of these exceedances, administrative orders were issued under the Alabama Water Pollution Control Act to address the groundwater contamination at each site. As a general overview to help you understand how groundwater monitoring works, there are 4 stages in groundwater monitoring. In the first stage, the utilities must establish background concentrations and develop a groundwater monitoring program. This means that the utilities determine what the background groundwater quality was around their site before any impacts. In accordance with the federal CCR rules, that had to be done by October 17th of 2017. As mentioned earlier, during this phase of monitoring, there were exceedances of the MCLs which the administrative orders were based on. The next step in groundwater monitoring is detection monitoring. In detection monitoring, the facility samples for what's called Appendix 3 constituents. These parameters include boron, calcium, chloride, fluoride, pH, sulfate, and total dissolved solids. These parameters were selected specifically because they permeate the ground and quickly move to groundwater. This provides an early indication that there may be an impact. In this stage of monitoring, the facility compares detected values to the background values that were established during the first stage of sampling. A facility is also evaluating if any detection is a statistically significant increase from background concentrations rather than just a single detection. If there is a statistically significant increase over background for any of these indicator parameters, a facility must move to the next phase of sampling, assessment monitoring. When in assessment monitoring, a facility must again evaluate for the Appendix 3 parameters, but also for what's called Appendix 4 parameters. The Appendix 4 constituents include antimony, arsenic, barium, beryllium, boron, calcium, chromium, cobalt, fluoride, lead, lithium, mercury, molybdenum, selenium, thallium, and combined radium. The theory behind this is that once the facility has moved to assessment monitoring, there is an indication that there may have been a release. So the next step is to determine if there really is a problem and to what extent. Facilities must develop groundwater protection standards while in assessment monitoring. In a lot of cases, the groundwater protection standards are set at the MCL. However, there are 4 parameters listed in Appendix 4, cobalt, lead, lithium, and molybdenum, for which EPA finalized specific values to be used as the groundwater protection standard. So when in assessment monitoring, a facility compares not to background, but to the groundwater protection standard. Again, facilities are looking for statistically significant increases over the groundwater protection standard rather than a single detection. If there is a statistically significant increase over that value, a facility must move to corrective action. This is the phase that all of the facilities in the state are currently in. When in corrective action, a facility must characterize the extent of the contaminant plume and evaluate methods to remediate the contamination. The regulations require that the facility return affected areas to original conditions, so facilities must evaluate what type of remedies would be most effective by looking at performance, reliability, ease of implementation, potential impacts, and control of exposure for each of the possible remedies. Once the facility has evaluated potential remedies, they are required to submit their proposal to ADEM for evaluation. Remedies must be protective of human health and the environment, attain the groundwater protection standard, control the source of the release, and remove the environment as much of the released material as possible. The department's oversight and enforcement role as it pertains to groundwater remediation is to evaluate the proposed remedies, advise the facilities on what adjustments need to be made, and approve the final remedies. Then the department is tasked with monitoring the effectiveness and requiring that adjustments be made if the remedy is not performing as intended. To date, the department has received various documents for review as it pertains to groundwater monitoring. As mentioned previously, the initial groundwater monitoring system had to be in place and background concentrations had to be established by October of 2017. The department received a report on those activities in February of 2018. The data contained in these reports led to the issuance of the administrative orders that were finalized in August of 2018. Next, in response to the administrative orders, the department received investigation plans which detailed plans to investigate the groundwater contamination at each site. In February of 2019, the department received the 2018 Groundwater Monitoring and Corrective Action Report for each facility. By the time of submittal, the facilities had established background, begun detection monitoring, and transitioned to assessment monitoring. In July of 2019, the facilities submitted the semi-annual groundwater monitoring reports, which detail how the facilities had moved from assessment monitoring to an assessment of corrective measures. The assessment of corrective measures for each unit was received in July of 2019. They detailed the evaluation of the potential remedies and included a proposal for a final remedy. The documents with an asterisk beside them are those documents that the department has received and reviewed. The department is in the process of consolidating comments for these documents to provide to the facilities. This table illustrates what contaminants have been identified at each of the facilities. It is important to note that groundwater monitoring takes place semi-annually, so every 6 months new data is gathered and evaluated, so the expectation is that the right-hand column of this table will change over time. The middle column includes data that was collected during the initial phase of monitoring and was the basis for the administrative orders. As mentioned before, those violations were based solely on MCL exceedances. The right-hand column lists what has been identified based on subsequent monitoring events. You may notice that in some cases the constituents differ between the two columns. For example, cobalt, lithium, and molybdenum do not have promulgated MCLs, which means even if they were detected during the initial stage of sampling, they would not have been included in the middle column. In other cases, a constituent of concern was not detected as a statistically significant increase in subsequent monitoring events. The groundwater investigation is still ongoing at each of the sites, and therefore the list of constituents is expected to change. This timeline provides a summary of upcoming milestones for both the permitting and groundwater remediation activities. Following the remediation timeline at the bottom, as mentioned earlier, the assessment of corrective measures were received in the summer of 2019. The comments for those ACMs are being prepared and are expected to be sent to the facilities in the fall of 2019. Investigation activities have not been completed, but the facilities have indicated that the investigation of the contamination plume should be complete and the data provided to the department by the end of 2019. Once those activities are complete and the facilities receive the department's comments, the utilities expect to be prepared to present their proposed final remedy to the public in early 2020. This will be done in the form of a public meeting to be hosted by the utilities at each of the facilities in accordance with the federal and state CCR rule. Assuming all of the department's technical concerns with the proposed remedies are addressed, the remedies are anticipated to be approved sometime in 2020.
Following the projected permitting timeline at the top, as mentioned previously, permit applications for the facility were received in December of 2018. ADEM is reviewed, commented, and has received response to comments on the draft closure plans. Also, ADEM is currently working on comments on the groundwater monitoring plans. Once all the department's concerns are addressed in both the closure and groundwater monitoring plans, the applications will be complete and ADEM will begin drafting permits for each facility. ADEM anticipates the drafting of the permits, giving notice to the public, holding public hearings, addressing any comments associated with the draft permits, and issuing final permits to occur sometime in 2020. This concludes our CCR presentation. If you have further questions on this matter, please contact ADEM's Solid Waste Branch at